Life on the home front during the relentless Allied bombings was a complex tapestry woven from fear, resilience, loss, and the stubborn determination to endure, despite overwhelming destruction. In the early months, when the skies first darkened with the distant growl of approaching bombers, a heavy shadow settled over the homeland, creeping into every household, conversation, and ordinary moment. People sensed that life as they knew it was slipping away, replaced by a new reality shaped by rationing, blackouts, and the constant awareness that death might fall from above at any moment. As the war intensified, the once familiar streets transformed into channels of tension. Even the simplest acts, walking to the market, sending children to school, preparing dinner, became fraught with uncertainty. Radios crackled with warnings, newspapers carried grim updates, and families gathered each evening with anxious glances toward the horizon, unsure if the sirens would sound again before dawn, unsure if the next night would be their last. When the sirens did wail, their haunting rise and fall cut through the air with a force that could freeze blood. People would scramble into shelters, clutching children, blankets, and whatever small comforts they could carry, all while the thunder of engines drew closer overhead. Inside the shelters, candles flickered weakly, illuminating faces pale with dread, yet held firm by the quiet persistence of hope. Families huddled together, whispering prayers or trying to distract their children with stories as the bombs began to whistle downward, each explosion sending tremors through the earth and sending dust raining from ceilings. Above ground, entire neighborhoods shook as firestorms roared through narrow streets, igniting homes, shops, and memories in a matter of minutes. Buildings collapsed with sickening cracks, ash drifted through the air like dark snow, and flames painted the sky a violent orange. Many who emerged from the shelters would find their homes reduced to rubble, walls crumbled, roofs torn apart, cherished belongings buried under the wreckage. Yet, even amid destruction, people moved instinctively to help one another, forming brigades to extinguish fires, pulling survivors from debris, offering water and blankets to the injured, and comforting those who had lost everything. It was in these moments of chaos that the resilience of the human spirit shone brightest. Strangers became lifelines, neighbors became family, and the community developed an unspoken understanding that survival depended not only on individual strength but on collective unity. Days after raids, the work of rebuilding, temporary but necessary, began anew. Streets were cleared, shattered windows boarded up, and makeshift roofs constructed from scavenged wood. Families salvaged whatever they could, a photograph singed at the edges, a book covered in dust, a piece of furniture miraculously spared. Daily routines were recreated out of necessity. Children returned to schools set up in basements or partially damaged classrooms. Shopkeepers reopened small stalls outside their ruined stores, and mothers cooked meals from whatever meager rations they could gather. These simple acts became symbols of defiance, testaments to a population that refused to surrender to despair. Yet loss was ever present. Every family had someone missing, wounded, or dead. Rooms remained empty. Chairs stayed unfilled, and the absence of familiar laughter weighed heavily on those who survived. Funerals were held quietly, often without the full presence of loved ones, as smoke still lingered in the air and new raids threatened to interrupt moments of mourning. Some children struggled to understand why their friends no longer came to school. Elderly parents clutched letters from sons and daughters on the front lines, rereading them in hope of comfort, and couples attempted to rebuild dreams shattered by war's brutal intrusion. Despite the grief, resilience grew, quietly, steadily, almost stubbornly. People learned to live with fear, without allowing it to consume them. They adapted to the unpredictable rhythm of war, waking each day uncertain of what awaited, but choosing to move forward anyway. Acts of kindness multiplied, a neighbor sharing food, a teacher comforting a frightened child, a medic working through exhaustion to save one more life. Faith, whether in religion, humanity, or simply in the promise of a new morning, became a lifeline that sustained people through the darkest hours. Children, too, found ways to cling to innocence. They played games in shelters, collected shrapnel like treasures, and learned to distinguish the sounds of different aircraft with unsettling accuracy. Their resilience became a source of strength for adults who watched them adapt with surprising grace. Even moments of joy, small and fleeting though they were, carried tremendous significance. A wedding held in a bombed-out church, birthdays celebrated with improvised treats, or families gathering around radios to hear news from the front. These moments whispered that life persisted despite everything. As the war dragged on, the homeland's landscape was transformed into a mosaic of ruins and temporary repairs. Entire blocks disappeared overnight, leaving behind charred skeletons of buildings. But each day, people continued to rebuild, to resist, and to hope. When victory finally came, it arrived not with the thunder of celebration, but with a cautious, trembling relief. Survivors stepped outside to quiet streets still bearing the scars of war, unsure of how to feel. Some wept openly, others stood in stunned silence, and many looked skyward, half expecting the familiar drone of bombers that no longer came. Gradually, celebration grew. Flags fluttered from windows, children danced in the streets, and songs returned to places where only the sound of destruction had echoed. But victory did not erase the ruins or the memories. The post-war homeland was a landscape marked both by devastation and by the incredible endurance of its people. Rebuilding became the next great challenge. Families constructed new homes where old ones had stood. Governments introduced ambitious reconstruction plans. Skilled workers and volunteers collaborated to restore factories, schools, and public spaces. Streets were widened, new buildings erected, and efforts made to ensure future generations would inherit not only rebuilt cities, but also stories of courage. Emotionally, recovery was slower. Survivors grappled with trauma, memories of loss, and the lingering fear that peace might suddenly shatter. Children raised during the raids struggled with nightmares, adults found themselves startled by loud noises, and soldiers returning from the front brought home their own burdens. Yet through shared experiences, communities supported one another, forming bonds that would endure long after the war. Memory became both a wound and a guide. The people honored the fallen with monuments, ceremonies, and personal rituals, ensuring no sacrifice was forgotten. At the same time, they looked toward the future with determination, planting gardens where rubble had once been, reopening theaters and markets, and restoring music to the air, and welcoming new life into a world still healing. The road forward was long, marked by both challenges and hope, but the people who had survived the bombings had discovered a profound truth, one that would shape generations to come. Though buildings could fall, though firestorms could sweep through cities, though losses could break hearts, the human spirit had a strength that even war could not extinguish. Life, no matter how scarred, would always find a way to rise again. In the end, the story of the home front was not merely one of destruction, but of resilience, unity, and the unyielding belief that even in the darkest nights, dawn would return. And so it did, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, illuminating a people who had endured the unendurable and emerged with their humanity intact. The war had not yet reached the farthest corners of the homeland when whispers of thunderous engines began slipping into everyday conversation, carried first by merchants returning from the western districts, then by soldiers on brief leave, and eventually by families huddled around radios each evening. Though the bombs had not yet begun to fall, the war's shadow had already stretched across towns and villages like a gathering storm, darkening the mood of markets, schools, and farms alike. In the early months, few truly understood what awaited them. For many families, the notion of cities set ablaze from the sky felt like a distant rumor, an unreal exaggeration born from fear. Yet the newspapers, carefully worded though they were, could not entirely conceal the magnitude of forces slowly moving closer. People sensed a change in the air, a heaviness, a quiet anxiety that lingered beneath their daily routines. Children noticed their parents speaking in hushed tones. Shopkeepers began stockpiling goods, not out of greed but out of instinct. And elders who remembered the last Great War felt an uneasy familiarity, as though history were preparing to claw its way back into their lives. The atmosphere carried a strange anticipation, a tension that settled into every household like a new member of the family, silent, brooding, and impossible to ignore. Radios were kept on more frequently, and families gathered around them as if the steady hum of broadcasts could keep fear at bay. Each announcement was met with a moment of stillness, as though the world held its breath waiting for the inevitable mention of approaching air raids. The government urged calm, insisting that the homeland was fortified, prepared, and resilient. Posters appeared overnight, pasted across walls in marketplaces, train stations, and factory entrances, depicting brave and stoic citizens working together under the nation's banner. But beneath the patriotic slogans, ordinary people knew the truth. No city, no matter how proud, could truly prepare for fire from the skies. Many began constructing makeshift shelters in their basements, converting cellars into storage rooms lined with preserved food, buckets of water, and blankets. Families who lacked basements dug pits behind their houses, covering them with planks and dirt in desperate attempts to create some kind of refuge. Schools organized evacuation drills, though the word evacuation was avoided in official instructions. Instead, teachers simply told children that these were precautionary exercises. But the worry in their eyes betrayed the truth. Mothers escorted their children to school each morning with a new kind of lingering farewell, holding them just a little longer before letting go. Fathers who worked in factories volunteered for additional shifts, not merely out of duty, but because productivity felt like a shield, something that could protect their families if the front lines moved any closer. As weeks turned into months, the war crept forward like a slow-moving tide. Reports of nearby towns being hit began filtering through official channels, though details were always minimal. People relied more on word-of-mouth accounts carried by travelers, train conductors, and distant relatives who wrote letters late into the night. These letters, sometimes smudged, sometimes hurriedly written, described sights that seemed too horrifying to imagine. Fire spreading across neighborhoods, glass raining from shattered windows, entire streets reduced to twisted fragments of metal and brick. Survivors who reached the homeland's interior spoke not only of destruction, but of the terrifying sound of bombers themselves, a deep, rolling hum that announced their arrival long before the first explosion. Despite these warnings, denial remained a stubborn companion. Many citizens held tightly to the belief that their region was safe, sheltered by distance or geography, or perhaps divine luck. Others convinced themselves that the war would end before the bombers reached them. Such hopes were understandable, even necessary. Hope, after all, was easier to cling to than the grim reality that soon the skies above their own homes might blaze with fire. Factories operated day and night, their smokestacks painting the horizon with thick clouds that blurred the line between dusk and dawn. The constant clanging of metal on metal became the soundtrack of the homeland's preparation. Workers, exhausted but determined, pushed themselves through double shifts with ragged breaths and aching backs. They understood that the weapons they produced might be the only thing standing between their families and annihilation. Yet even the sense of purpose could not fully silence the whispering fear that crept into their minds whenever the factory doors opened and the vast, vulnerable sky loomed overhead. Cultural life, once vibrant, began to dim as theaters canceled performances and community festivals were postponed indefinitely. Weddings were delayed, christenings held quietly, and funerals conducted without gathering crowds. People did not speak openly about the changes, but everyone felt them. The once lively streets seemed muted, as though laughter itself had become too fragile to survive the weight of uncertainty. Families prepared in their own ways. Some kept small suitcases packed by the door, just in case. Others memorized the locations of the nearest public shelters. Grandparents told stories of the last war, trying to offer wisdom, or perhaps simply distract the younger generations from their fear. Children, for their part, tried to understand what was happening, but struggled to grasp the enormity of it all. They sensed danger as one senses a storm approaching, a drop in barometric pressure before the first crack of thunder. When the government finally announced the first mandatory blackout, the realization settled in. The shadow of war had fully reached their doorstep. Windows were covered with dark cloth, streetlights shut down, and entire neighborhoods were cast into darkness each night. In that darkness, fear became a more intimate companion. The absence of light made every sound sharper, every distant noise more alarming. Families gathered around single candles or oil lamps, speaking in soft voices to preserve the stillness. From rooftops, wardens patrolled the streets, ensuring that no stray beam of light escaped into the night sky. But even with all precautions, no one could ignore the undeniable truth. The homeland was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a target. The first distant rumble of engines came on a chilly evening that began like any other. Families had just finished their meager suppers, rationing had already tightened food supplies, and were settling into their nightly routines when a low, unnatural vibration began to creep across the land. It was subtle at first, like faraway thunder. Some dismissed it, telling themselves the weather was changing. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. People stepped outside their homes, squinting at the dark sky, though nothing could be seen. Radios crackled with sudden urgency as broadcasters instructed listeners to seek shelter. Immediately. The words were spoken calmly, but they carried the force of a hammer blow. For many, it was the first time the threat had become real. Mothers scrambled to gather children, fathers double-checked the basement doors, and elderly relatives were guided down steps with trembling hands. The sound overhead grew into a monstrous roar, vibrating through walls and rattling the ground beneath their feet. Though the bombs that night fell on a nearby city rather than their own, the psychological impact was enormous. The shockwaves rolled across fields and hills, faint yet unmistakable. Some families felt windows tremble, others heard the distant thud of explosions and stood frozen, unable to move. For the first time, people experienced the helplessness of waiting in darkness, waiting for news, waiting to learn whose homes had been lost. In the days that followed, a new rhythm emerged, one dictated not by clocks but by alerts, drills, and rumors. The homeland could no longer pretend it was safe. Its shadowed fear had deepened into something tangible, something that pressed on the lungs and tightened the chest. And yet, amid the fear, resilience began taking root. Neighbors checked on one another more often. Families devised plans, improved shelters, and learned to listen for subtle shifts in sound. They adapted because they had no other choice. The war had come, and though the bombs had not yet begun to fall on their own streets, the people of the homeland knew that the shadow over them would only grow darker before light could return. The first true air raid came not with flames but with a sound. An unforgettable, piercing wail that split the night open and sent every man, woman, and child scrambling from their beds. It began as a distant cry, a thin ribbon of noise barely distinguishable from the wind. But within seconds it grew into a shrill, rising scream that seemed to vibrate inside the bones of every listener. People had been trained for this moment, drilled repeatedly in what to do when the warning sirens began, but no amount of preparation could fully suppress the panic that erupted in households across the homeland. The drills had always felt slightly theatrical, like rehearsals for a play no one truly expected to perform. But the sirens that night were no rehearsal. They were the real beginning of terror from the skies. Families poured into the streets, some half-dressed, others clutching blankets, flashlights, or buckets of water as they rushed toward the nearest shelters. Children cried out for parents. Parents screamed their children's names into the darkness. Dogs barked wildly as though the sky itself were tearing open. The blackout was strict, and not a single street lamp guided their way. Entire neighborhoods moved blindly, guided only by memory and the echo of neighbors' footsteps. The air itself felt colder, heavier, carrying with it a faint vibration that hinted at the engines powering the distant bombers. Every breath seemed to tremble with dread. Inside the shelters, the atmosphere was suffocating. People packed shoulder to shoulder, sitting on crates, benches, or the bare ground as they waited for the raid to begin. The scent of damp earth mixed with sweat, kerosene, and fear. Conversations were hushed, but urgent, filled with questions no one could answer. How many bombers were coming? Which part of the city would be hit? How long would they need to stay underground? Every few minutes, new families arrived, panting, sobbing, or shaking as they emerged from the darkness. Wardens moved through the crowds, checking attendance lists and offering short, stiff reassurances. Then the second sound came, the deep, stomach-churning hum of engines overhead. It rolled across the city like thunder, but lacked the randomness of weather. This was deliberate, steady, mechanical. It was the sound of men in distant cockpits steering death toward homes, schools, churches, and memories. Even the smallest children understood instinctively that this sound meant danger. The shelter fell almost completely silent. All that could be heard were the engines, the occasional cough, and the trembling breaths of terrified families. The first explosion landed somewhere to the east, its shockwave faint but undeniable. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. A baby began wailing, its cry cutting sharply through the stillness. Then another explosion, and another. Each blast came closer, louder, fiercer, as though the bombers were crawling across the sky in slow, predatory circles. The ground shook, and at times the entire shelter seemed to breathe in fear as wooden beams creaked and small stones tumbled from the walls. People clutched one another, some whispering prayers, others whispering apologies or promises or names of loved ones. Hours passed, though to those underground, time felt tortured, stretched into a shapeless void. Some fell asleep from exhaustion, jolting awake with every distant blast. Others remained rigid, staring at the floor or ceiling as though expecting it to collapse. The fear was not merely of death, but of the unknown. Would they emerge to find their homes standing, their streets intact, their neighbors alive? The mind flickered endlessly between hope and despair. When the all-clear siren finally sounded, it felt unreal, soft, gentle, almost melodic after the horror of the night. People hesitated to move, unsure whether they could trust the signal. Slowly, the wardens announced that it was safe to leave, and families began to rise, stretching stiff limbs and blinking into the darkness outside. The city was unrecognizable. The air was thick with dust and smoke, illuminated only by the faint glow of fires burning in the distance. Silence hung heavily, broken occasionally by the crackle of collapsing timber or the distant sob of someone discovering what they had lost. Streets that had once been full of life were now coated in rubble. Windows were shattered, roofs torn away, doors blown from their hinges. Entire blocks were unlit, their electricity cut off by the bombings. People wandered in shock, searching for familiar landmarks, trying to comprehend the damage. Some found their homes intact and fell to their knees in gratitude. Others arrived at empty spaces where their houses once stood and cried silently, unable to process the devastation. But amid the grief, something else emerged, a spirit of unity. Neighbors who had barely spoken before embraced each other. Men formed impromptu rescue teams, digging through rubble in search of survivors. Women distributed blankets, food, and water to families who had lost everything. Even children helped by carrying small buckets of debris or delivering messages between adults. No one was untouched by the experience, and no one was left behind. As dawn broke, the full scale of the destruction became clear. Yet so too did the bravery of the citizens. They stood in the ruins of their city, weary but unbroken, knowing that this was only the beginning. The nights ahead would bring more sirens, more fear, and more destruction. But they also carried determination, resilience, and an unspoken promise that they would endure whatever the sky unleashed upon them. The raids that came after those first terrifying nights were no longer a mystery. People had learned the patterns, the distant hum, the rising wail of sirens, the rush to shelters, the trembling darkness underground, and finally the deafening blasts that tore at the fabric of the city. But nothing prepared them for the night the firestorms came, a night etched forever into memory, when the sky itself seemed to burn and the city was transformed into a furnace of roaring flames. It began with an intensity unlike anything before. The sirens wailed earlier than usual, their cries stretched long and sharp across the evening air. People knew instantly that something far more powerful was coming. Even before the first bombs fell, wardens shouted for immediate evacuation to the deepest shelters. Families grabbed blankets, documents, photographs, whatever they could carry, and fled into the streets. The ground already seemed to vibrate with the weight of incoming destruction. The bombers arrived in waves. The first dropped high-explosive bombs designed to tear open roofs, shatter buildings, and expose wooden beams. Entire neighborhoods shook violently as these explosives slammed into the earth, sending shards of brick and stone spinning through the air. People in shelters felt the ground swell beneath them, heard the groaning collapse of buildings overhead, and clung to each other in desperation. Then the second wave began, the incendiaries. Small but deadly, they fell by the thousands, scattering across rooftops like burning seeds. Each one ignited upon impact, sending sparks leaping from house to house. Fires erupted instantly, racing along rooftops, swallowing attics, and consuming everything in their path. Streets that had once been quiet and familiar now glowed with an eerie orange light, as though the horizon itself had caught fire. Within minutes, the city was engulfed. Heat rose in massive waves, bending metal, exploding windows, and igniting anything that could burn. The flames fed on each other, growing hotter, taller, faster. They created swirling columns of smoke and sparks that rose high into the sky, forming a tornado-like vortex, a firestorm, sucking oxygen from the streets and sending fiery winds howling between buildings. People trapped outside shelters were thrown to the ground by blasts of hot air. Sparks rained down like molten hail, burning through clothing and hair. Entire blocks collapsed as wooden beams cracked and stone walls buckled under the overwhelming heat. The roar of the flames drowned out even the sound of bombs still falling overhead. Inside the shelters, people felt the temperature rising. The air grew thick with dust and smoke that seeped through cracks. Mothers fanned their children with trembling hands. Elderly residents struggled to breathe. A haunting glow seeped through air shafts, turning the darkness a sinister red. It felt as though the world above had become a single burning organism. When the bombers finally left and the all-clear sounded, people hesitated to rise. The silence felt unnatural, as if the city were holding its breath after screaming for hours. But when they finally emerged, they found themselves stepping into a landscape that no longer resembled their home. The streets were unrecognizable. Houses stood as empty shells, their interiors exposed to the smoky sky. Others had collapsed entirely, leaving piles of rubble still glowing with embers. Trees had been reduced to black skeletons. Entire blocks smoldered, sending thin trails of smoke curling upward like mourning banners. The smell, an unbearable mixture of ash, burning wood, and destruction, filled the air. The firestorm had created wind tunnels that carved paths of devastation through neighborhoods. Some houses remained strangely untouched, standing beside ruins as though spared by chance or miracle. Survivors wandered in shock, clutching the hands of their loved ones, searching for missing family members, or staring silently at the remains of their lives. Rescue teams worked through the night and into the next day. They dug through smoking rubble, calling out names, listening for muffled cries, and lifting debris with bare hands when tools proved too slow. Fire brigades fought tirelessly against lingering flames, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Volunteers distributed water, blankets, and first aid, moving from family to family like exhausted angels. Yet even in the face of such devastation, something remarkable happened. The community did not crumble. Instead, it hardened. Neighbors became protectors. Strangers became friends. People opened their surviving homes to anyone who needed shelter. Mothers took in orphaned children. Men formed lines to carry bricks, buckets, and beams. Women cooked meals over makeshift stoves for those who had lost everything. The firestorm had taken much, but it could not extinguish the will of the people. Amid the ruins, they rebuilt their courage, piece by piece, breath by breath. They swept streets, salvaged belongings, and restored what little could be saved. And though the nights ahead would bring more bombers, more terror, and more destruction, the people understood now that they possessed a strength they had never known before. They had stood in the heart of a firestorm and survived. The morning after the firestorms, the city awoke to a silence so profound it felt like the breath of a world mourning its own destruction. Smoke drifted through the air in ghostly ribbons, rising from ruins that had once been homes, shops, churches, and memories. The devastation stretched as far as the eye could see, streets choked with rubble, streetlights bent like wilted flowers, and walls charred into brittle fragments that crumbled at the slightest touch. And yet, amid this desolation, people began to emerge, slowly at first. Then, in growing numbers, men, women, and children stepped cautiously into daylight, brushing ash from their clothes and blinking through the haze. The war was far from over, but the city understood one thing with absolute clarity: rebuilding could not wait for peace. Before the bombings, rebuilding had always been a concept associated with the future, something that would happen after victory, after treaties, after a long-awaited return to normal life. But as the war intensified and air raids became routine, the people learned that rebuilding had to be woven into the very rhythm of survival. Every day that passed without action meant more families suffering in makeshift shelters, more streets left impassable, and more morale slipping into despair. So they rebuilt while the threat still loomed overhead, while sirens continued to shriek in the night, and while uncertainty haunted every hour. The government issued immediate directives. Emergency teams mobilized, architects inspected weakened structures, and engineers plotted ways to restore water, electricity, and transportation. But these teams were not enough. There were too many broken homes, too many shattered buildings, too many lives in limbo. The citizens had to step forward, and they did so with a determination forged in the darkest nights of bombing. Groups formed naturally, as though instinct guided them. Carpenters repaired beams, masons reconstructed walls, and laborers cleared debris one brick at a time. Women organized supply stations, preparing food and distributing water to workers. Children ran errands, carried wood, and passed notes between rescue teams. Even the elderly found ways to help, mending clothing, watching younger children, and sharing experience from earlier decades of hardship. Everyone contributed, because everyone understood the stakes. Rebuilding was not only physical, it was deeply emotional. Each corner of the city held memories: weddings celebrated in the old hall, festivals dancing through the main square, and quiet evenings shared in small cafes before the war changed everything. People were not merely reconstructing buildings, they were stitching back together the fabric of their lives. When a family's home was restored, even in partial form, it felt like reclaiming a piece of identity the war had tried to erase. But rebuilding, while bombs still fell, was a constant test of courage. Workers stood atop scaffolding, repairing rooftops, all while casting nervous glances at the sky. Families who had returned to their homes slept lightly, knowing another raid could undo months of effort. And yet, despite the fear, the work did not stop. Rebuilding became a rebellion against despair, a declaration that the enemy could destroy buildings but not hope. Nighttime remained the greatest challenge. After each long day of reconstruction, the city was plunged into darkness once again. Blackout curtains were hung, lamps dimmed, and streets fell silent. People lay awake listening for the sirens' distant wail, knowing that at any moment the fragile progress they had made could be shattered. And sometimes it was. A single raid could undo entire weeks of work. Buildings under repair collapsed once more, fresh scaffolding burned, and workers found themselves standing in the ruins of their own perseverance. Yet even then they started again. A key part of the rebuilding effort came from solidarity. Neighbor helped neighbor regardless of background, age, or wealth. Social divisions that once defined communities became irrelevant in the face of shared struggle. Families who had never spoken before now shared bread, tools, and stories. Some opened their surviving homes to strangers, turning living rooms into communal shelters. People discovered unexpected strength in unity, understanding that survival depended not on individual resilience, but on collective effort. Schools attempted to resume classes even if inside damaged buildings or temporary tents. Teachers improvised lessons using chalkboards propped against rubble and notebooks salvaged from debris. For children, education became a lifeline, a connection to normalcy, and a promise that the world would one day return to peace. Their laughter, though softer and more cautious than before, brought life to streets that had grown accustomed to the sound of destruction. Markets reopened slowly. Vendors sold whatever goods they could gather, sometimes trading instead of selling, sometimes giving away supplies to those who had nothing left. The smell of freshly baked bread, scarce and precious, brought tears to the eyes of passers-by. The small comforts, like a warm bowl of soup or a repaired pair of shoes, became symbols of resilience that no bomber could destroy. Infrastructure posed one of the greatest challenges. Water lines had been ruptured, power stations damaged, and communication networks disrupted. Crews worked tirelessly to repair pipes under streets piled high with debris. Electricians climbed precarious poles to reconnect lines. Blackouts still occurred frequently, but each hour of restored power felt like a victory. Radios crackled once again with community announcements, news updates, and occasional music that drifted through windows like a reminder of gentler times. Mental strain also weighed heavily on the population. Many struggled with fear, exhaustion, and the haunting memories of nights spent under bombardment. But there was little time to dwell on trauma. Survival demanded action. Conversations over shared meals often slipped into confessions of fear, dreams of future peace, and hopes of rebuilding not just buildings, but lives. Priests, doctors, and community leaders offered comfort where they could, reminding people that endurance itself was an act of courage. As months passed, parts of the city began to look alive again. Streets were cleared, homes patched, and shops reopened. Children played cautiously among the ruins. Flowers even bloomed in some courtyards where ash had settled, as though nature itself was determined to participate in the rebuilding. The contrast between destruction and life created a haunting but beautiful landscape, a testament to humanity's ability to rise from the devastation. But the war continued. Sirens still wailed, bombers still passed overhead, and the people braced themselves each night. They lived in a constant cycle of rebuilding, losing, and rebuilding again. Fatigue weighed heavily, but determination never vanished. The people understood that even if their progress was repeatedly undone, the act of rebuilding was necessary. It was a declaration of identity, a refusal to surrender to fear. And somewhere deep within every survivor was a quiet belief, fragile but glowing, that one day the war would end. One day the city would rebuild fully, without interruption. One day the skies would fall silent not because of darkness, but because peace had finally returned. Until that day came, the people rebuilt with a steady, unbroken spirit, carrying the knowledge that hope, like the city itself, could always rise again from the rubble. Loss came in many forms during the long months of war. It arrived not only in the thunderous blasts that tore apart streets and homes, but also in the quiet absences left behind after each raid. The empty chairs at dinner tables, the silent rooms that once held laughter, the belongings scattered in rubble that whispered of stories abruptly cut short. As the bombings continued night after night, the people of the homeland learned to navigate a world where grief was as constant as the setting sun. Yet intertwined with that grief was something else, a resilience that refused to be extinguished, a strength of spirit that emerged from the very heart of suffering. Every day brought news of losses. Some families lost their homes, others lost their livelihoods. Some suffered injuries that altered their futures, and many endured the unbearable pain of losing loved ones. Funerals became simple, quiet affairs, held in makeshift spaces, attended by small groups of mourners who whispered prayers through tears. Cemeteries expanded slowly, row by row, as names were added to the growing ledger of the fallen. Yet, even in mourning, the people found ways to honor the dead. Through candles placed in windows, through stories shared around dinner tables, and through the determination to keep living, if only to preserve the memories of those who no longer could. Loss also came in subtler forms. Children lost parts of their childhood, games replaced by drills, carefree days replaced by nights spent in shelters. The elderly lost the sense of stability they had worked their whole lives to build. Couples lost the futures they had imagined together, forced to accept a world reshaped by destruction. Shops where people once gathered in conversation were reduced to ashes. Schools that had echoed with laughter now stood as hollow shells. Streets once filled with music and festivals lay quiet beneath layers of soot. Loss permeated daily life, reshaping the rhythm of existence. Yet, through this constant erosion, the human spirit adapted. Resilience grew in places where despair sought to take root. Families rebuilt even when they were exhausted. Neighbors supported one another even when they themselves were struggling. Communities discovered strength they had never known, binding together in bonds forged under fire. Resilience was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and unwavering, showing itself in the hands that lifted rubble, in the meals shared among survivors, and in the courage it took to face each new day. One of the strongest sources of resilience came from the deep sense of unity that developed among the people. Differences in class, background, and belief faded as everyone faced the same fear and the same threat from the sky. Strangers became allies, neighbors became family. People learned to rely on one another for comfort, safety, and survival. In shelters, they shared stories to ease the tension, passing time with whispered tales, songs, and memories that reminded them of life beyond the war. These small moments, fleeting yet powerful, became lifelines that helped sustain hope. Acts of quiet heroism emerged everywhere. A mother who carried her children through burning streets and refused to give up. A warden who remained above ground during raids to guide latecomers to safety. A doctor who worked tirelessly through sleepless nights, treating the wounded with steady hands despite the chaos around him. A teacher who held classes in the ruins of a school, determined to protect the minds of the young, even when the world outside crumbled. None of these people sought recognition, but their courage strengthened the entire community. Faith, too, became a source of endurance, not only religious faith, but faith in humanity, in tomorrow, and in the possibility of peace. People prayed in their homes, in shelters, and in the charred remains of churches, seeking solace in spirituality. Others found faith in routine, a cup of tea shared with family, a small flower blooming in a shattered courtyard, a letter from a loved one fighting on the front lines. Hope was fragile, but it was enough to sustain them through the darkest nights. Children displayed remarkable resilience as well. They adapted to life in shelters, learned to sleep through distant explosions, and invented games that could be played quietly in the dark. Their innocence brought moments of unexpected light, breaking through the gloom with questions, laughter, or curiosity. Many parents drew strength from their children's ability to find joy in even the smallest things. A smooth stone, a story, a scrap of paper turned into a toy. In these simple acts, the adults saw reminders of what they were fighting to protect. Resilience also took shape in the decision to continue living life despite the war. Couples still fell in love, even if their dates took place in blackout conditions. Babies were still born, bringing with them cries that sounded like declarations of defiance. Birthdays were celebrated with shared smiles, even if the cake was small or improvised. Weddings were held in damaged chapels, with flowers gathered from gardens that had somehow survived the flames. Each of these moments was an act of courage, a statement that the war could not stop life from unfolding. As the bombings continued, people learned to find strength in routine. They cooked meals with whatever ingredients they had, patched clothing, cleaned homes, and tended to gardens. These everyday actions became acts of resistance, small but powerful. The enemy sought to break their spirit, but routine helped protect it. A clean room, a warm meal, a repaired chair, each gesture whispered, "We remain." Of course, resilience was not constant. There were days when even the strongest hearts faltered, days when exhaustion overwhelmed courage, when grief felt heavier than hope, when the sound of the siren triggered panic too deep to ignore. People cried openly at times, unable to carry the burden alone. But they learned that resilience was not the absence of fear or sadness, it was the ability to continue despite them. It was the willingness to rise after each devastating blow, to rebuild after every raid, to believe in a future that remained shrouded in uncertainty. In the darkest moments, when the city lay in ruins and the sky seemed poised to fall again, the human spirit revealed its greatest power, the capacity to endure. People survived not because they were unafraid, but because they moved forward even when afraid. They carried each other through grief, offered hands to those who stumbled, and shared what little they had. In doing so, they created a tapestry of strength woven from countless acts of kindness, bravery, and love. Loss defined the era, but so did resilience. The people refused to surrender their humanity to the brutality of war. They held on to hope, love, and unity with a fierceness that no bomb could extinguish. And it was this resilience, born from shared suffering and collective courage, that allowed them to face the uncertain road ahead with unbroken souls and spirits still glowing beneath the ashes. Victory did not arrive with the triumphant roar many had imagined during the long, terror-filled nights of bombings. It came quietly at first, whispers spreading through streets still scarred by fire, conversations exchanged between neighbors leaning out of shattered windows, and cautious announcements on radios crackling with static. Yet beneath the quietness lay an unmistakable shift. The war that had overshadowed every moment of life was drawing to a close. When the news was finally confirmed, the people stepped out of their homes, some rebuilt, some temporary, some still half-ruined, and looked up at a sky that had so often brought destruction. For the first time in years, it felt expansive rather than threatening. Children who had grown accustomed to sirens and shelters stared upward in confusion, waiting for the sound of engines. When none came, a strange stillness settled over the land. It was a silence that seemed almost foreign. Celebrations began slowly, as if people feared the news might somehow reverse itself. Flags appeared from dusty trunks, songs rose hesitantly from trembling voices, and small gatherings formed in streets where rubble still lay in piles. Some wept openly, overwhelmed by relief. Others simply stood quietly, their expressions distant, as if trying to understand what life without the constant threat of bombing might feel like. Victory, after so many years of hardship, felt surreal, almost too fragile to be believed. But even as the people celebrated, they could not escape the reality that victory had arrived hand in hand with ruin. Streets that had once been familiar were now unrecognizable, lined with broken facades and hollowed-out buildings. Landmarks that had defined neighborhoods were gone, replaced by gaps in the skyline. Homes lay in varying states of destruction, some missing roofs, others reduced entirely to ashes. Families wandered through these ruins, searching for remnants of the lives they had lost, a photograph, a book, a trinket, a memory made tangible. The landscape of the homeland had been reshaped by fire and impact. Entire districts bore the scars of relentless bombing. Factories that once hummed with the rhythm of work stood silent, their machinery twisted beyond repair. Schools, churches, shops, and theaters, all the places where life had unfolded, now stood as shells. And yet, amidst this devastation, the people found signs of resilience. A tree still standing despite the bombs, a wall unbroken in a street of destruction, a flower blooming where debris had fallen. Rebuilding became the new battle, one fought not with weapons, but with determination, sweat, and collective effort. The government issued plans, but communities often moved faster, driven by the instinct to restore what had been lost. Men and women volunteered in teams, clearing rubble bucket by bucket. Carpenters and masons offered their skills to rebuild homes for those who had none. Young people who had spent years navigating wartime fear now found themselves hauling bricks, planting gardens, and painting walls. Each repaired structure felt like a declaration, "We survived." Yet rebuilding was not merely physical, the emotional landscape required healing just as urgently. Families confronted the absence of loved ones who had not lived to see victory. Parents grieved children lost to bombings. Children adapted to life without parents who had perished or gone missing. Couples reunited after years apart, only to realize war had changed them in ways they could not yet express. Communities were filled with joy and pain in equal measure, intertwined like threads of the same fabric. The wounds beneath the surface were often the hardest to mend. Some survivors avoided certain streets, unable to walk past the ruins of places that held painful memories. Others struggled with silence, their minds still echoing with the phantom wail of sirens. Children who had spent their early years in shelters feared the dark long after the war ended. Nighttime remained unsettling for many, sparking memories of raids even when the sky was peaceful. Despite these struggles, hope grew stronger with each passing day. Schools reopened in temporary buildings, and the sound of children laughing returned to the streets, a sound many had feared lost forever. Shops began to fill with goods again, and markets reopened, drawing crowds eager to reclaim normal life. Trains resumed regular schedules, and the once darkened cities began to glow with carefully restored lights. Music returned, flowing from radios and gatherings, filling the air where the sound of bombs had once dominated. The return of soldiers from the front brought its own challenges and joys. Families reunited in emotional embraces, but the men and women who came home carried invisible burdens. Some struggled to adjust, haunted by memories of battle. Others found solace in the simple routines they had longed for during the war. Communities embraced their veterans, offering them support, understanding, and gratitude for their sacrifices. As months passed, the homeland began to transform. New buildings rose where old ones had fallen, designed not only to replace what was lost, but to symbolize a future rooted in strength. Streets were widened, parks restored, and monuments erected to honor those who had died. The people took pride in each step forward, recognizing that rebuilding was not just a task, it was a testament to their endurance. Memory became a guiding force in shaping the post-war generation. Survivors shared their stories with children who had been too young to remember the worst years. They spoke of courage, unity, and the countless acts of kindness that had kept them going. Museums collected artifacts, photographs, and testimonies, determined to preserve the past so that future generations would understand the cost of war. Remembrance days were established, giving families a way to honor the fallen together. But even as they remembered, the people looked toward the future. Hope became more than a fragile flame. It grew into a steady light. Weddings filled halls again, and new families were formed. Babies born in the post-war years were seen as symbols of renewal. Gardens flourished in places once choked by smoke. The homeland, though forever changed, began to breathe again. Victory had come at an immense price. The ruins scattered across the land served as stark reminders of suffering, but also of survival. The road forward was long and uncertain, marked by challenges both seen and unseen, yet the people walked it with unbroken spirits, strengthened by everything they had endured. They carried with them the lessons of the past, the necessity of unity, the resilience born of hardship, and the unwavering belief that life could rise even from ashes. In the end, the true victory was not merely the end of the war, but the triumph of the human spirit. The bombs had fallen, the fires had burned, and the losses had been profound. But through it all, the people had refused to surrender their hope. They rebuilt their homes, their cities, and their hearts. They faced the future not with fear, but with determination. And as the homeland slowly transformed from a landscape of ruins to one of renewal, the people found peace, not only in the silence of the skies, but in the enduring strength that carried them forward into a new dawn.